regardless of management model, we must have a large enough areas with protected forests for nature conservation in the landscape. And in the managed parts of the forest area, green infrastructure and functional habitats and substrates are also needed. The first to give a lecture in this session is Per Angelstam. Per, welcome. Now it's your turn to talk.
Thank you. Do you hear me loud and clear? You see the full screen?
Yes, everything looks good.
Very good. Thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting meeting. I will try to focus on, well, I will focus on three aspects: green infrastructure, and that requires high conservation value forests, more than what we have actually, and also a landscape approach. So my outline is that, as you all know, I hope, green infrastructure is about functional networks representing all the land covers or ecosystems in both actually terrestrial and aquatic and marine systems. I think it's important to remember that there are many kinds of ecosystems. So the concept has to be in plural. You have to have, separate green infrastructures for let's say Scots pine forests and broadleaf deciduous forests and so forth. And that you can discuss details, but all land covers consist of patches, and if they are better, so higher quality from the point of view of particular species perhaps or function, if they are bigger, if there is more of them, and if they are joined, are four very important criteria which all have to be considered. Sometimes researchers debate which is which, but they are all important. And if we want to make trade-offs between all the different ecosystem services or nature's benefits that we want from forests, it's crucial to map high conservation value forests sort of wall to wall, both for planning, but also to evaluate the functionality of the green infrastructure. And of course, to cope with this requires that you bring people together, and the term that appeared actually more than 15 years ago is called landscape approach or ecosystem approach, a tool to support evidence-based learning. And then at the very end, I will sort of reflect on the role of evidence versus narratives, because I think this is quite important. The first thing to note is that Sweden is a very tall country in the sense that it extends from broadleaf deciduous forests in the south and a few intact forest landscapes in the northern mountain region. So the mountain forests are also having a different ownership pattern. This is mostly state. The boreal forests are usually a mixture of industries and family forests, and the hemiboreal and nemeral forests are mostly families. And these maps on the right, they depict the situation in four areas in Sweden: in Jokkmokk, in northwest of Härnösand, around Tiveden National Park, and in northeastern Skåne. And the maps, they come from a project that I'm involved with together with Swedish and Polish researchers that tries to do wall-to-wall mapping of high conservation value forests. So we have made it a database for each hectare in the whole of Sweden. And the red is the best and blue is the worst. And you can see, for example, in the second panel from the north of Tiveden National Park, and also the islands which form a so-called eco-park that this Sveaskog State Forest Company has. So remember that Sweden is tall. That's the bottom line. And of course, if we want to evaluate something, we have to have a principle. And I think this was, the meeting began today with Victor talking about sustainable forest management as a principle. And then there is a long process that has and is covering the formulation of criteria and indicators. But what we still haven't really come to, at least not at the political level, or not enough at least, is the norm. Because unless we agree on where we are and what we want and how to get there and how to evaluate it when we are there, measuring indicators becomes sort of meaningless, because they can show an increase, but it could still be so far away from what we want to achieve. So I think evaluation is what I'm going to talk today. So, and then of course linked to learning. So learning through ongoing evaluation, I think I believe is a very important aspect of well, implementing ideas about sustainable forest management. So when it comes to habitat functionality, this is easy to use this principle of these 4 letters with better, more, larger, and joined. So this is from a paper which we published, a team a couple of years ago, which actually follows up on what Lars said, that the what has been left is on the red areas above the mountain forest border, and the other areas have been passing through one or several rounds of rotation forestry. And the result is that the functional networks are confined to these remote areas, and there are some small patches throughout Sweden. And the blue areas are really hot spots, or sorry, they are really cold spots. So there the situation is really poor. And of course, the requirement of the species that you want to model matters very much. So on the right hand, there is a species that doesn't demand so large patches, and of course then there is less blue, versus the left map which shows the model for species which are more demanding. And we have validated this using independent bird counts, and actually these models they work nicely actually. And what is important is that when we think about protected areas, many people count numbers. But I think it's really important to stress, as does the Convention for Biodiversity, Aichi Target 11, that it's about quantitative and qualitative criteria. So this is also from a publication where we just highlight these different regions in Sweden. They exhibit very different situations when it comes to the sum of formal, voluntary retention trees and unproductive land. But if you start looking at the quality and the degree to which patches are joined, then the situation becomes worse. So I live in this South Boreal region. So if we sum everything without consider qualities, just look at quantities, then of course the situation looks better than if we do that. And then if you compare with a norm, there are several norms that they can be negotiated or evidence-based, but this red band sort of paints the range from the 17% of the Aichi target and from the 10 plus 20% that is in the European biodiversity strategy. So depending on how you count, and if you include quality, you can conclude that Sweden has reached such targets. If you divide it into different regions, you get a completely different piece of so-called evidence. And if you really look into the qualitative targets, then the situation is actually quite gloomy. So depending on the stakeholders' interest in being complete, or I would say honest, you can get very different results. Another example is the amount of dead wood, which is also a common indicator also at the European level. And the way you present data is very important. So this is the official statistics on the amount of dead wood in the same regions as before. And if you make the y-axis long, or tall, from 0 to 100 cubic meters per hectare, you can see that yes, there is an increase in most of Sweden, but there is also a decline in the northwest. But what is important is to compare it with a norm, and one norm could be the natural range of variability in terms of deadwood. As Lars hinted in the beginning, there was lots of deadwood in the naturally dynamic forest. And there is a lot of reviews and actually a lot of knowledge about how much of deadwood species need. Maybe this is in this range. So again, depending on whether you relate a number of the result of an indicator to a norm also matters, because without talking about natural range of variability or threshold intervals, you could claim that everything is increasing and everything is fine. But if you really want to conserve, as the Swedish policy says, viable populations of naturally occurring species, then of course you cannot do like that. So I think that it's important to note that policy on biodiversity conservation, it actually builds on a sort of evidence-based rule of thumb. So the European Commission talks about 30% protected, of which 10% should be strictly protected. And this is exactly what Ilkka Hanski summarized in his paper in Ambio in 2011, a third of a third. So again, some argue or believe that these policy targets are just sort of invented, sort of taken out from the blue. But if I talk like a conservation biologist, these numbers 10 plus 20 is actually, it is evidence-based. Some don't like it, but that's a different story. But then if you have 30%, what happens, or what should happen to the other 70%? And that's what I'm going to spend some time on now. There are, of course, different ideas on how to combine the production of different ecosystem services in different contexts. And one idea is that multiple use works fine, that you can actually achieve biodiversity conservation, social values, and whatever raw material you need in the same stand, in the same local area. And this represents sort of integrative approach. You try to integrate everything in one stand. The opposite of this is really segregate, to separate the provision of habitat for species and the biomass production. And of course, then you can have the different mixes, and one approach that appeared, I think, in the early 90s is called triad. So it actually has three types of intensities: biomass, like a plantation, habitat, and multiple use. And of course, the preconditions for doing in any of these ways depends on the local regions and local landscapes, land use history. It depends on the ownerships, and it depends on the owners' different mandates and the interest in doing different things. But this is just to say that there are different alternatives. And there is now really a lot of research that I would say clearly shows that to achieve this, and to achieve multiple use of all the values in one stand, this is simply not feasible. It's not effective. And then the other option is to do some kind of segregation or a combination of those two. And there is I would say, a massive piece of literature showing the need for segregation. On the other hand, this is very difficult because in many countries there are many small forest owners, including Sweden and Finland, and that makes active division of the land into different purposes difficult. regarding these 70% of that could be used for other things than the biodiversity conservation only, there are many terms. You can talk about, of course, even-aged forest management, which constitutes about 97% of what we do in Sweden. You can talk about continuous cover forestry. You can talk about clear-cut free forestry, retention forestry, close to nature forestry. The EU proposed something closer to nature forest management. That is nature-based forest management. And of course, there are traditional systems like agroforestry or silvopastoral systems, which we have, for example, on the Iberian Peninsula. And we heard much today about natural disturbance regimes. And if you follow, there is an interesting paper by a guy named Dunker and others. I will do like this first. They ranked forest management systems according to how much they alter patterns and processes. And then those red ones are the ones that impact forests the most. And retention forestry, of course, that can be heard from the word. There is some more of natural legacies left. Close to nature forestry has the same ambition. But still, when you quantify, let's say, the biomass which is not removed, it is still very high. And this is where closer to nature forest management or nature-based forest management systems come in. And the silvopasture systems and traditional agroforestry and natural forest disturbance regimes, they sort of represent the vision of where we would like to go to be closer, so to say. I'll go back to this picture and explain this. If you really want to somehow vectorize a forest management system, I think that there are three variables that you need to consider. And one is the proportion of trees which are removed when you harvest. So it goes from 0 to 10. It's also the size of the treatment unit. It can be very small or it can be very big. And how often you come back also matters. You can come back very, very seldomly, or you can come back very often. So a plantation forest in, I don't know, in Paraguay or in South Africa, you remove everything. The interval is very short, and the size, it can vary, but it's not really super big. And even-aged forest management and even-aged with retention is sort of in the same corner of this cube. And old growth is in the absolute opposite of the cube. And high grading is the exploitative timber frontier forestry that Lars mentioned in the beginning, so to cut the big trees. And then this would be uneven-aged for forest management. So I think this is a way just to think about that the forest management system has to be evaluated at different scales, at different intervals, and different removal rates. Many become a bit upset when you color even-aged forest and the continuous cover forestry red. Actually, they both, and also clear-cut forestry, represents a business-as-usual approach which has the focus on producing wood. The focus is nothing else. And I think a big gap in the research is that we tend to do studies at the fine scale, square meters, hectares, forest stands. But in order to compare forest management systems, we actually have to compare landscapes, and that's rarely done. And then adding retention forestry and close to nature forestry could be like a business as usual plus. And here I stress the R, so becoming closer to these visions. This gentleman was chosen as an illustration that what happens at the EU level is actually quite important. And I put together with both Timo at this meeting and Lena have been involved in writing a report which talks about the principal strategies and the framework for flexible European-wide implementation of this term, closer to nature forest management. And this has been a very, very interesting exercise, and there's actually a meeting tomorrow, a webinar, where you can listen to the presentation. And what is interesting here is that there are voices of all kinds of researchers from all of Europe, and it was really interesting to deliberate these discussions. And I think we really agree on everything, that you have to sort of encourage the diversity of ownerships of forest ecosystem types and adapt how we do in different parts of Europe. And the very short summary of this report is, of course, that now we are usually far away from the natural forest. And this is the natural forest, which is this vision. And close to nature forestry, or closer to nature forestry, could be applied to silver fir and beech, to Douglas fir, Norway spruce and birch, and to sycamore, maple, and ash. Of course, to the boreal ecosystem as well. The third item I wanted to touch upon is landscape reports, and I will do this quite briefly. I met it at the first time at the World Forestry Congress in Buenos Aires in 2009, which presented the idea of a framework used to integrate policy and practice for multiple land uses within a given area, a landscape or a region, and to ensure equitable and sustainable use of land while strengthening measures to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So essentially, it is the same as sustainable forest management, but it really stresses this evidence-based dialogue. And there are, of course, many attempts to do this, and they have different routes. I mean, a biosphere reserve ultimately has this meaning. The Canadians invented the term model forest. There is something called learning lab, which is often used in let's say, urban settings. And there is a big research network called long-term socioecological research that focus on this. And to illustrate this in a way that you might remember it, those who have an opportunity to go to Stockholm should go to a really beautiful museum, Valdemarsudde, and there is an exhibition there with paintings of a Norwegian landscape painter. He lived about 100 years ago. And he depicts this fjord landscape in Western Norway, which both has this vision of the cultural landscape. So this is a pollarded willow tree, which has been made into a troll or an animal. And then on the slopes in the background, there are very steep slopes with lots of natural disturbances, dead wood with enormous amounts of dead wood. And the most common woodpecker is the white-backed woodpecker. So this is a landscape that really reflects both these visions of cultural landscape and natural dynamics. There is also, let's say, strong social cohesion. So this is there is a habit in Norway, to many other countries too, to make a fire at Midsummer Eve, and this illustrates this need for social capital, that you have to work together. You may not agree, but at least try to work in a way that things don't stink to the other part. So really try to remember this funny tree and the mountains and this Midsummer Eve. Finally, I want to reflect on something that I was experiencing last Thursday, actually a few days ago, because I was invited by the European Commission to meet Frans Timmermans. He was in Sweden, and this was a very short meeting, just 1 hour, but with people from the industry, from different NGOs, and I was the only researcher. And what I did afterwards was to sort of reflect on what was said, and mostly what was not said, which I find quite frustrating. Diversity is much broader than most realize, and it has been stressed several times that it's not only about species or components or habitats or structures or about functions and processes, but it's about all these things. And actually, we've heard the word resilience a few times, and actually this is the most important aspect, and we don't talk very much about this, in fact. Coming back to this idea of using criteria and indicators, there is a term called weak sustainability and another term called strong sustainability. And this is a little bit like a mother having sick kids, and she's given a thermometer, but it doesn't show where 37 is. So you have to have norms. You have to know what you should aim at in the long run, of course, and not just look at the temperature change, because if the kid's temperature changes out of the range, it doesn't tell you anything. It's even dangerous. Another aspect which is, I think, important in many countries, and particularly in the Boreal, is that you have to look at the economies of the forest industry versus the non-industrial private forest owners. There is a legacy of the industry being, let's say, good, providing tax money so you can build swimming holes and you can build infrastructure in rural areas. And you should be loyal as a private forest owner to deliver this industrial raw material, because in the societal contract, the money will come back through improved infrastructure, not green infrastructure, but to more welfare and well-being. But this is no longer the case. So we have to separate the interests of the non-industrial forest owners who doesn't have the opportunity to create that much value-added products as opposed to the forest industry. So this is really a power game, which I think one has to highlight. Another thing which was very clear at the meeting, like the one I participated in, is that the political scientists, they talk about the concept called coalition alliance. And this is really you could call this a group of people who have very strong connections, although they are at different levels in society and within different sectors. And if their interest is to focus on something narrow, like producing industrial raw material, and have the power to exclude other stakeholders, then it's really dangerous. And this is the typical situation in a country like Sweden. I would argue that, according to my political science colleagues, this is also the case in many other countries. And the solution is really to encourage learning through ongoing evaluation, to really define where we are in terms of different aspects of sustainable forest management. Where do we want to go? Are we moving there? Are we moving there fast enough? And I think even at that 1 hour meeting, I faced something that I find extremely annoying, and this is the use of fake narratives and cherry picking of facts. And I will give you one example. What's happening now? So one of the participants of this short meeting said that Sweden's forestry is sustainable because we make clear cuts that are 3 hectares. So the question is that a meaningful indicator of sustainability? So this is just an example from the open access database of Swedish forests provided by the Swedish Forest Agency, and it shows a lot of interesting things. But here I have highlighted 3 polygons. These are polygons representing areas notified belogged, areas that were harvested 1 to 3 years ago, and those were harvested 3 to 10 years ago. So if you zoom in a little bit, so if you move around in this landscape, this is 2 by 2 kilometers, so this is 1 kilometer. I know exactly what it is. So the perception when you move in this landscape, if you walk around or drive around, is that this is a really large quote unquote clear cut. This is another one. This is another one. So if you calculate the mean of each individual treatment areas, this is around 3 hectares actually here. It doesn't tell you anything. And of course, this is another example from northern Sweden. This is part of Västerbotten County and also northern Jämtland. This shows that the loss of forest which has a high potential to host continuous cover forests, so meaning that they have not been completely clear cut. The maps shows the situation in 1973, 83, 93, 2003, and 2013. So there is like an erosion. And if you view the red as something that you would like to eat, if you use a small spoon or a big spoon, it doesn't matter. It disappears all the same. This is something we can see very clearly when you look at the national statistics. This is the age distribution according to the National Forest Inventory. And I've divided it into stands which are 0 to 80 years, 81 to 120 years, and more than 120 years. And there isn't that much of this forest left, and it'll be gone in, let's say, around 10 years. And this is 120. This is when let's say, old growth characteristics begin to appear. And this is around 10%. And of course, this means that these islands are little patches, quite fragmented usually, with poor connectivity in a sea of production forests. So if you want to read stuff, I write a lot of papers. So this is going to be in your hands after the meeting. And then for those who read Swedish, I have written a quite fat report that summarizes what I have said today. So this will appear at the SLU website in a couple of weeks, I guess. Thank you very much. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Per, for a very interesting lecture. The first question here is, how much of the Swedish economy is dependent on forestry? So how big is the part of the GDP, for instance?
I have actually looked into this, and I think the oldest figures I have found are from the early 1950s, and then it was something like 12 to 14%. And now I think it's around 2, a little over 2, and I think the industry's contribution is bigger than the contribution of forestry. So it's minor. And actually, when you look at the trend, I think there was a publication by the tech industry, and over the last, I guess, 20 years, the proportion of GDP for forestry has dropped from around 5% to 2%, but for the tech industry, it has increased in the to the same amount. So it's.
Thank you. And the follow-up question: how big economic values are obtained from other ecosystem services?
But I think this is the big challenge, that we have developed ways of doing monetary evaluation, and there are different tricks that economists use to try to estimate it in monetary values. But there are many values which cannot be measured using money, and actually there is a big literature showing the need to actually measure the actual resource. So if you want to measure the functionality of a green infrastructure, of course, then you have to measure that. You cannot measure this in money. And I think it really comes back to, there is an interesting American author, Aldo Leopold, who wrote a lot of interesting things a long time ago, and they, in many countries in the world, when people are concerned with something that is important to them, they develop rules and norms, and there are proverbs, there are holy groves of Madagascar. I've seen it in India, in Kerala also, and I think we need a wider portfolio of tools to value things, to value different values with different tools, but we haven't come there.